A millionaire CEO hadn't touched a woman in 20 years, but his new assistant changed everything. Before we start the story, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy. The atmosphere at Smith Enterprises was unusually tense that morning. The normally busy hallways buzzed with whispers and curious glances. "Have you heard?" one of the administrative employees murmured. "Yes. Henry Smith hired a new assistant. Does she know about the rule?" "I doubt it. This is going to be a disaster." The rule in question was simple but unshakable. Henry Smith never touched women. Not a handshake, not even an accidental brush against someone. Over the years, female employees had learned to navigate around this quirk. Some dismissed it as billionaire eccentricity, while others speculated about a mysterious past trauma. Whatever the reason, no one dared to get too close. But Sophia Morris, the newly hired personal assistant, had no idea. It was her first day, and she couldn't understand why the office felt so heavy. People glanced at her with a mix of pity and curiosity, as if she were walking straight into the lion's den. Morris, Emma, the executive secretary, called out urgently, "Mr. Smith needs a tie. Grab one and take it to him now." Sophia blinked. "Sorry, what?" "The tie, Morris. He has a meeting in 10 minutes. Hurry." "Okay, just a tie. No big deal," she thought. What could go wrong? She walked to the executive dressing room and opened the cabinet where Henry's ties were kept. That's when she hit a small problem. There were at least 50 of them. "All right, what color would an untouchable CEO wear?" she muttered. She picked a navy blue one, then a black one, then a gray one. Then panic set in, and she grabbed them all. With her arms full of ties, she marched toward the CEO's office. The plan was simple. Hand him a tie and leave. Easy. She knocked on the door. "Come in." Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside and found Henry Smith adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, looking like a man who had already solved a financial crisis before breakfast. He glanced up and frowned. "What is that?" "Ties," Sophia said, stopping in front of him. "All of them. I didn't know which color you preferred, so I brought them all." Henry stared at her for a moment before sighing heavily, as if summoning patience he didn't have. "Give me one." Sophia dumped all the ties onto the desk and randomly picked one to hand to him. Henry raised an eyebrow. "A patterned one." She glanced at the tie and realized, in her rush, she had grabbed one with tiny rubber duck prints. "Oh!" She quickly snatched it back. "Not that one, wait." She grabbed another and handed it to him. "Navy blue." Henry gave a brief nod. Mission accomplished. Now she just had to walk out. But then she saw it. Henry was tying his tie completely wrong. She blinked, then blinked again. He was absolutely butchering the fabric, as if he were trying to strangle an invisible ghost. This was a crime against corporate fashion. An uncontrollable urge took over. Without thinking, she stepped closer and raised her hands. "Wait, you're doing it wrong. Let me." And then she touched him. The moment her fingers brushed against his neck, Henry froze. Sophia felt his entire body tense beneath her fingertips. The shift in the air was almost visible. Then suddenly, "No!" Henry jumped back as if he had been electrocuted. Sophia's eyes widened. "Oh my God, what happened?" Henry was staring at her like she had just attacked him. "You touched me." I was just fixing your tie." Sophia frowned. That was definitely an overreaction. Never do that again. "Okay, relax. I'm not radioactive, you know." Henry ran a hand over his neck, as if trying to erase the feeling of her touch. His breathing was uneven, and his eyes held a tormented look. "You don't understand," he said, his voice tight. "Then make me understand." Sophia shot back, crossing her arms. "Because honestly, this makes no sense at all." His fists clenched as if he was fighting something within himself. "I can't be touched." "What do you mean can't? Do you explode? Turn into a frog?" "This is not a joke." Sophia fell silent. His tone was raw desperation. He was genuinely shaken. Henry looked away, his jaw tightening. "Just don't do it again." She hesitated, unsure what to say. She had never seen someone react so badly to a simple touch. But as she studied his face, she saw something beyond anger. Fear. He was terrified. Sophia sighed, raising her hands in surrender. All right, I won't touch you again. Henry's shoulders relaxed slightly, but he still looked tense. You can go. Sophia rolled her eyes. Fine, boss. No touching. But one day, I'm going to figure out what's so scary about it. She walked out of the office, completely clueless about what had just happened. As the door closed behind her, Henry touched the spot where her fingers had been. His heart was still racing. This had never happened before. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, her touch lingered, and that changed everything. The entire office seemed to be watching as Sophia Morris stepped out of the CEO's office. Her face was slightly flushed, her expression puzzled. She had no idea what had just happened. What was that? Henry Smith had reacted to her touch, as if she had cast a spell on him. Dramatic. That was the only word that came to Sophia's mind. She walked to her desk, dropped into her chair, and massaged her temples. Her first day already felt like a disaster. So, you survived, came the voice of Max Turner, the head of the finance department. He was a man in his mid-30s, always carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the look of someone who had seen it all in this company. Sophia frowned. What do you mean by survived? Max leaned against her desk, taking a sip of his coffee. No one touches Henry. Ever. Sophia blinked. Okay, this is getting weird. Why not? Because he just can't stand it. He has this rule. No woman can touch him. Sophia huffed. Well, he could have warned me before having a meltdown, right? Wait a second. Max's eyes widened. You touched him. Technically, yes. But it was his fault. His tie was all wrong, and my need for order took over, so I just fixed it. Max looked at her as if she had just spilled coffee on the U.S. Constitution. You put your hands on him. I just fixed his tie. Max let out a laugh, clearly in disbelief. Congratulations, Sophia. You just broke 20 years of protocol. She rolled her eyes. Oh, please, no one dies from an accidental touch. Little did she know, inside the CEO's office, Henry Smith was completely thrown off. He stared at the report open on his computer screen, but none of it made sense. The charts, the spreadsheets, the market forecasts, everything was jumbled. And all because of what? A single touch. His fingers ran along the collar of his shirt, where his tie was still perfectly in place. That was what unsettled him. He should have felt discomfort, disgust, anxiety. But he didn't feel any of that. Worse, he didn't feel anything bad at all. And that terrified him. The last time someone had touched him like that was 2 decades ago. It had been a disaster. Since then, his body had learned to reject any physical contact from a woman. So why was Sophia different? Abruptly, he stood up, pushing his chair back. He walked toward the glass wall overlooking the city. His reflection showed a man who, for the first time in a long time, didn't understand himself. This had to be a coincidence. An exception. He needed to test it. 2 hours later, Sophia was focused on a report when the voice of Henry's secretary came through the phone. Mr. Smith wants you to go to his office. Sophia froze. Again. Yes, and bring the report on the investor meeting. He wants you to hand it to him directly. Directly into his hands? Raising an eyebrow, Sophia grabbed the papers and walked to her boss's office. When she entered, Henry was standing behind his desk, watching her with his usual unreadable expression. Here's the report, Mr. Smith, she said, walking toward him. Henry reached out his hand. She hesitated for a second. This guy freaked out a few hours ago because I touched him, she thought. Still, she extended the papers to him. Then it happened. The moment Henry's fingers brushed against hers, his body tensed again. It was quick, subtle, imperceptible to any observer, but inside him, it felt like worlds colliding. Again, he felt it. A shock ran through his nerves. His heart skipped a beat. Trying to play it off, he grabbed the papers too quickly, causing one of the sheets to slip and fall to the floor. Damn. Out of reflex, Sophia bent down to pick it up. But just as she stood up, Henry bent down too. The result? Forehead to forehead. It was a light bump, but enough to create an awkward silence. His eyes were way too close to hers. Sophia held back a laugh. If this was a reflex test, congratulations, you passed. Henry cleared his throat, straightening up and quickly gathering the papers. That wasn't a test. Oh, sure. Bumping heads is a great work method. He didn't respond. He just turned to his desk and pretended nothing had happened. Sophia crossed her arms. Mr. Smith? Yes. Are you nervous? He looked at her with calculated coldness. I don't get nervous. Sophia smirked. Then you won't mind if I do this. She raised her hand slightly, pretending she was about to touch him again. Henry took a step back, so fast he nearly tripped over his chair. Silence. Sophia laughed. Wow, for someone who never gets nervous, that was a pretty dramatic reaction. Henry shot her a sharp glare. That's enough for today. You can leave. Sophia walked out, still laughing. Meanwhile, Henry, for the first time in years, had no idea how to handle the situation. She was a problem. And worse, he was starting to like it. Henry Smith was officially lost. Ever since the tie incident and that cursed report that forced him to touch Sophia Morris's fingers, even briefly, he could no longer ignore her presence. And that irritated him deeply. For 20 years, he had lived without anything or anyone breaking his personal barrier. He kept his distance from any physical contact with women, and it had never been an issue. On the contrary, it had become a firm rule, a well-structured system that gave him control over everything. But then Sophia showed up. She was different from any other assistant he'd ever had. She wasn't intimidated by him. She didn't tremble when speaking to him. And worse, she didn't take his rules too seriously. And now, Henry was making the #1 mistake for a man like him. He was paying attention to her. And over the past few hours, that was becoming a serious problem. He had noticed his eyes searching for Sophia even when he didn't mean to. When he passed by the cafeteria, he saw her laughing with colleagues and felt an absurd irritation for no apparent reason. During a meeting, he noticed she bit her lip when she was focused, and his brain stored that information for no reason at all. To his absolute frustration, he discovered that Sophia talked to herself when she was alone. Yes, he had seen her earlier in the office, typing something on her computer while mumbling softly to herself. Who came up with these ridiculous spreadsheets? Were they designed to torture assistants? She sighed, then muttered, If I mess this up, I bet he'll glare at me like I just ruined his entire life. Henry raised an eyebrow. Was she talking about him? He shouldn't be paying attention to this. He shouldn't care. But he did. And then it happened. Sophia made a small mistake. It was just a formatting error in the financial report. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to catch his attention. He picked up the paper, analyzed the mistake, and pressed the intercom button. Sophia in my office. Now. Silence on the other end. After a few seconds, he heard a hesitant voice. You mean right now? Like right now. Henry closed his eyes, feeling a wave of impatience. That's what I said. 2 minutes later, Sophia walked into his office. If you call me like that over the intercom again, I might have a mini heart attack. Henry didn't respond. He simply held up the report, pointing out the mistake, and stared at her. What is this? Sophia tilted her head, frowning. A piece of paper. He rolled his eyes. What's wrong with this piece of paper? She took the sheet and quickly scanned it. Henry crossed his arms, waiting. Okay, I admit it, Sophia sighed. I forgot to align the columns in the second chart. But Mr. Smith, let's be honest, no one ever died because of a misaligned table. If I wanted chaos, I'd start a tech company and wear flip-flops to work. But no, I have a reputation to uphold. Sophia raised an eyebrow. So you don't wear flip-flops even at home? Henry closed his eyes for a second, officially running out of patience. Sophia. All right. She raised her hands. I'll fix it. No more misaligned tables, I promise. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, Henry blurted out without thinking. Do you always talk to yourself? Sophia froze in place. Slowly, she turned back to him. What? Henry kept his expression neutral. I saw you mumbling to yourself earlier today. Do you do that often? Sophia's eyes widened. You saw me talking to myself. Yes. She looked genuinely shaken. Oh no. Sophia covered her face with her hands. This is terrible. Why? Because I try my best to seem at least somewhat normal, and now you know I have this flaw. Henry frowned. Talking to yourself is a flaw, isn't it? Sophia hesitated. You're not messing with me, are you? Henry sighed. Sophia, I don't have time to mess with people. I'm a billionaire CEO. She stared at him for a second, then burst into laughter. And that's when Henry realized how comfortable he felt in that moment. Sophia didn't seem impressed by his wealth. She didn't treat him like some untouchable figure. And without realizing it, he was starting to like that. But he couldn't allow it. If this continued, he would lose control. And Henry Smith never lost control. Ever. Henry Smith didn't like distractions. His world had always been structured, meticulous, with every detail planned to prevent the unexpected. But in the past few days, everything seemed out of place. And all because of her, Sophia Morris. Ever since that woman broke his rules, Henry found himself acting in ways he never expected. He caught himself paying attention to her more than he should. And that was becoming a serious problem. Henry had started noticing Sophia in ways he hadn't expected. He caught himself observing small details, how she furrowed her brow when concentrating, or the way she absent-mindedly played with her bracelet while reading a document. It had to stop. Yet, no matter how much he tried to maintain control, something else bothered him even more, the touch. For 20 years, he had avoided any physical contact with women. The mere thought of someone crossing that boundary made him tense, uneasy. But then Sophia came along, and nothing happened. No discomfort, no anxiety, no urge to recoil. And that realization tormented him more than he wanted to admit. He tried to push it aside, to focus on work. Holding a gold pen, he attempted to review a multimillion-dollar contract, but his mind dragged him back to the past, a past he had spent years trying to forget. 16 years ago, Henry wasn't the powerful business mogul he was today. Back then, he was just an ambitious young heir trying to prove himself. And like any young man, he believed in love. His heart belonged to Amelia Wright, a woman with a sweet smile and captivating eyes. He had given himself to that relationship completely, believing Amelia was his future, his partner, his confidant, until the day he learned the truth. She didn't love him. She loved his wealth, his status, his influence. And when someone more powerful entered the picture, she left without hesitation. The breakup wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. Henry could still remember the moment Amelia held his hands and said, in the coldest tone imaginable, "You were never enough." Those words cut deep. That was the moment something inside him shattered. That was when he realized the human touch could deceive, that affection could be a facade, and that closeness could be a trap. So he built a rule. He distanced himself, put up walls, and stopped trusting. He refused to allow vulnerability. 20 years passed. 20 years without touching anyone, until Sophia Morris. Henry blinked, snapping back to the present. His grip on the pen was so tight that his fingers had turned white. His heart was racing. This had to stop. He wouldn't let a simple assistant shake the foundation of what he had built. If Sophia had managed to breach his defenses, then he would fortify them even more. No more casual moments. No more closeness. No more touching. Determined to end this, Henry stood up and marched to her desk. Sophia was sitting there, chewing on a granola bar while reviewing a document. Everything seemed normal until she felt an intense gaze on her. She looked up and nearly choked when she saw Henry standing before her with the most serious expression she had ever seen. "Mr. Smith?" she asked, confused. He crossed his arms. "From now on, we will keep our relationship strictly professional." Sophia blinked. Wait, wasn't that already obvious? Henry remained firm. No jokes, no touching, no unnecessary proximity. She stared at him, baffled. Unnecessary proximity? We barely talk outside of work. What do you think I'm doing, trying to seduce you? Henry wasn't expecting that. I didn't say that. But you're acting like I'm some kind of threat to your existence. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came, because deep down she was right. He was overreacting, but he needed to react this way. It was the only way to regain control. "Just follow the rules," he said firmly. Sophia narrowed her eyes, but didn't argue. "All right, boss. Whatever you say." She turned back to her screen, giving him no further attention. Henry stood there for a few more seconds, feeling an odd sense of frustration. The idea of Sophia ignoring him bothered him more than it should. Before he did something foolish, he walked away. The next day, Sophia decided to give him exactly what he wanted: strict professionalism. She kept interactions brief, handed over reports without small talk, and avoided unnecessary conversation. But to her surprise, Henry seemed irritated by it. She noticed fleeting glances, furrowed brows, and subtle signs of frustration. Then something unexpected happened. Late in the afternoon, Henry called Sophia into his office. When she walked in, she saw him holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "Here." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "You bought me coffee?" Henry looked away. "The barista made a mistake. I grabbed it by accident." She knew that was a lie. "Oh, right. Because baristas mix up 2 identical coffees for the same person all the time." He didn't respond. Sophia suppressed a smile. Henry Smith was trying to make amends in his own awkward way. And maybe, just maybe, he was more confused than he let on. That only made things even more interesting. That night, Henry Smith realized something even worse than his lack of control. He wasn't just losing his grip on his rules. He was losing his grip on himself. Henry Smith had always hated social events. Gala dinners, business receptions, charity parties. They were all the same. The same people, the same forced smiles, the same surface-level conversations. But as the CEO of Smith Enterprises, his attendance was mandatory. Avoiding these gatherings would only fuel unnecessary rumors. Tonight was another one of those dreaded occasions, a charity auction. The room would be packed with business executives, investors, and high society elites, all pretending to care about noble causes while subtly competing to see who could outspend the others. And to make things even worse, he needed a date. CEOs of major companies typically arrived with a companion, a business partner, a fiancé, or someone influential. In Henry's case, all these choices felt equally annoying. Without overthinking, he made a snap decision. Sophia, his assistant, Sophia Morris, glanced up from her computer, startled. "Yes." He exhaled. "I have a charity event tonight. I need a date. You're coming with me." She blinked in surprise. "Excuse me." "It's a charity auction. Nothing complicated. Just be there, stay discreet, and represent the company by my side." Sophia crossed her arms, studying him. "So let me get this straight. You've spent the past few days making it painfully obvious that you don't want unnecessary closeness, and now you suddenly want me to accompany you to an event." Henry remained unfazed. "Yes." She let out a dramatic sigh. "Mr. Smith, I don't know if you've noticed, but you're sending some seriously mixed signals." "Just agree to it, Sophia. It's better than bringing anyone else." "Wow, thanks for the enthusiasm," she said dryly. Ignoring her sarcasm, he turned back to his computer. "Dress appropriately. I'll pick you up at 7 o'clock. Sophia opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. If he wanted to take her, who was she to refuse? At exactly 7 o'clock, Sophia was ready. Her usual office look was replaced with something far more elegant. She wore a black, thin-strap dress that hugged her figure just right, classy, not over the top. The flowing fabric highlighted her graceful stance, and instead of her usual messy bun, her hair cascaded in soft waves. When Henry arrived, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, he paused for a split second upon seeing her. Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" He blinked, quickly regaining his usual composed expression. "None. Let's go." Minutes later, they arrived at the extravagant event hall. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, classical music played softly, and waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Sophia scanned the room, noticing how many people were stealing glances at Henry. "You seem pretty popular here." "Popular isn't the right word." "Oh, right. You're the mysterious CEO who doesn't touch women. I bet half these people are trying to figure out how someone managed to get you to bring a date." He sighed. "Please watch your words." She smirked. "But where's the fun in that?" As they spoke, several guests approached Henry to greet him. He remained as composed as ever, answering politely, but keeping his usual distance. Sophia, on the other hand, noticed an unwelcome presence. A tall blonde woman in a striking red dress was making her way toward them. Her sharp eyes and calculated smile made it clear she wasn't here for pleasantries. "Henry," the woman said with an all-too-familiar tone. He gave her a curt nod. "Amelia." Sophia immediately recognized the name, Amelia Wright, the woman who had shattered Henry's heart years ago. And judging by the tension in the air, their story was far from over. Amelia's gaze flicked to Sophia. "I'm surprised to see you here with a date." Sophia saw an opportunity and took it. She slipped her arm through Henry's, smiling warmly. "Oh, he's a gentleman. He'd never let me come alone." Henry tensed, but he didn't pull away. Amelia's smile faltered for a brief second. "Is that so?" "Well, Henry has always been reserved." Sophia tilted her head. Maybe he was just waiting for the right person to break that reserve. Amelia studied her for a moment before giving a tight-lipped smile and walking away. Henry exhaled. That was unnecessary. Sophia shrugged. "I refuse to let an ex downplay my presence." He eyed her carefully. "You enjoy causing trouble, don't you?" She grinned. "Let's just say I'm good at evening the playing field." Henry watched her a second longer than he should have. There was something different about her. She wasn't intimidated by him. She wasn't afraid of him. And for the first time that night, he realized that having her by his side wasn't such a bad thing. Hours later, as they finally left the event, Sophia collapsed into the car's seat with a tired sigh. That was more exhausting than a full day at the office. Henry drove in silence. After a moment, she turned to him. "So, was the event a success?" He gave a small nod. "Yes, the company's presence was well received." She smiled. "And what about me? Did I pass as a formal event companion?" He glanced at her briefly before turning his attention back to the road. "You were tolerable." She laughed. "Is that the best compliment you can manage?" Sophia smirked. "So, that's the closest thing to a compliment I'm going to get." Henry didn't respond, but for the first time that night, a faint, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his face. Sophia noticed, and she liked what she saw. When they reached her building, she turned to Henry before stepping out. "Thanks for taking me." He nodded. "Good night, Sophia." She smiled and got out of the car. As Henry watched the door close behind her, he felt something strange. He should have been relieved that the night was over, but he wasn't. And that, more than anything, left him completely confused. Henry Smith couldn't sleep. The clock read 2:43 a.m., and he was still lying in the darkness of his luxurious apartment, staring at the ceiling as if the answers to his frustrations were hidden there. But he knew exactly what was bothering him, Sophia Morris. The night at the event was supposed to be a formality. He was supposed to take her, fulfill his social obligation, and move on with his life without a second thought. But instead, he couldn't get her out of his mind. The way she smiled when teasing Amelia, the way her black dress flowed as she walked through the ballroom, the way she held his arm, without hesitation, without fear, without the careful restraint every other woman showed around him. And worst of all, he hadn't felt the need to pull away. That terrified him. For years, Henry had lived in isolation. Human touch was something he avoided, something that made him uncomfortable, even repulsed. But Sophia didn't affect him the same way, and that was unacceptable. He shut his eyes tightly, trying to push those thoughts away. But the more he tried to block them out, the stronger they became. Frustrated, he got up and walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. Maybe this was just a passing whim, something meaningless. He just needed to stick to his routine and ignore any thoughts about Sophia. That was all. The next morning, Henry arrived at the office at his usual time. He walked through the lobby without looking to the sides, just as he did every day. Employees straightened up as he passed, and no one dared to interrupt his path. But then his eyes found Sophia. She was sitting at her desk, finishing her coffee, laughing at something Max Turner had said. That laugh, something inside him twisted. Without realizing it, his steps slowed. It was a subtle detail, but Max noticed. The head of finance gave Henry an amused look, as if he knew exactly what was going on. "Good morning, Mr. Smith." Max greeted him, with a slightly teasing smile. Henry hardened his expression and kept walking, ignoring the remark. Sophia turned to him, holding a folder of documents. "Good morning, boss. Ready for another intense day of spreadsheets and meetings?" He stopped next to her desk, looking at the folder in her hands. "Is the report ready?" "Right here." She extended the folder to him. Henry hesitated for half a second before taking it. The memory of their last touch was still fresh in his mind. But to his surprise, Sophia didn't let go right away. She held it firmly, forcing him to look her in the eye. "Are you okay?" The question caught him off guard. "What? You seem off today." He kept his expression neutral, pulling the folder from her hands with more force. "I'm perfectly fine." Sophia narrowed her eyes, unconvinced. "If you say so." She turned her attention back to her computer, but Henry stood there for a second longer than he should have. Then, without another word, he walked into his office, trying to ignore the fact that Sophia could see right through his cold exterior. The day dragged on, slow and frustrating. Henry tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to the past few days. He needed to snap out of this. She was just an assistant, an employee like any other. So why couldn't he stop noticing every little detail about her? By the end of the afternoon, he decided to do something to regain control. He called Sophia into his office. When she walked in, she looked completely at ease, as if she wasn't dealing with one of the most feared CEOs in the country. "Go ahead," she said, leaning against the doorframe and crossing her arms. Henry took a deep breath. "From now on, I want to keep all interactions strictly professional. No unnecessary conversations. No jokes." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?" "Yes." She tilted her head, studying him. "So, I assume that also means you'll stop staring at me all the time, right?" Henry stiffened. "I don't stare at you." Sophia flashed a mischievous smile. "Oh, so it's just a coincidence that every time I look up, your eyes are already on me?" He kept his serious stance. "You're mistaken." She laughed. "If you say so, boss." She turned to leave, but Henry felt something tighten inside him. Before he could think twice, the words left his mouth without him realizing it. "Are you free for dinner tonight?" Sophia stopped in her tracks. She slowly turned around, her eyes slightly wide. "Wait, what?" Henry cleared his throat. "Dinner. With me." Sophia blinked a few times. "Is this a joke?" "No." She studied him for a few seconds. "And here I thought you didn't want unnecessary conversations." "It's a business dinner." "Of course it is." She smirked, and Henry realized he had already lost this battle. 2 hours later, Henry and Sophia were seated in an elegant restaurant. Sophia looked at the menu, pretending to be impressed. "Wow, even the prices here seem arrogant." Henry didn't respond. "So, is this how you always invite someone to dinner? No explanation, no warning." He set the menu down on the table. "I figured you wouldn't say no." She laughed. "And I didn't. I'm just surprised." The waiter came to take their orders, and once he walked away, Sophia leaned slightly over the table. "Why did you bring me here, Henry?" He hesitated. "I told you, it's business." The closest thing to a compliment she was going to get. Henry didn't respond, but for the first time that night, a faint, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his face. Sophia noticed, and she liked what she saw. When they reached her building, she turned to him before stepping out. "Thanks for taking me." He gave a slight nod. "Good night, Sophia." She smiled and got out of the car. As Henry watched the door close behind her, he felt something strange. He should have been relieved the night was over, but he wasn't. And that, more than anything else, left him completely unsettled. Henry Smith couldn't sleep. The clock read 2:43 a.m., and he was still lying in the darkness of his luxurious apartment, staring at the ceiling as if the answers he needed were hidden there. But he knew exactly what was bothering him. Sophia Morris. The charity event was supposed to be just a formality. He was supposed to take her, fulfill his obligation, and move on without a second thought. Yet, his mind kept replaying the night, the way she smiled while teasing Amelia, the way her black dress moved as she walked, the way she held his arm without hesitation, without fear, without the caution every other woman showed around him. And worst of all, he hadn't felt the need to pull away. That terrified him. For years, he had kept his distance from people. Human touch was something he avoided, something that made him uncomfortable, even repulsed. But with Sophia, she didn't affect him the same way. That was unacceptable. Henry squeezed his eyes shut, willing the thoughts away. But the more he tried, the stronger they came. Frustrated, he got up and walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. Maybe it was just a passing distraction, something meaningless. He just needed to stick to his routine and ignore her. That was all. The next morning, Henry arrived at the office at his usual time. As always, he walked through the lobby without glancing sideways, his presence alone making employees straighten up as he passed. No one dared to interrupt his path until he saw Sophia. She was sitting at her desk, sipping coffee and laughing at something Max Turner had said. That laugh, light, unrestrained, full of warmth, made something twist inside him. Before he even realized it, his steps slowed. Max noticed. The head of finance shot Henry an amused look, as if he knew exactly what was going on. "Good morning, Mr. Smith," Max greeted, a teasing lilt in his tone. Henry hardened his expression and kept walking, ignoring the remark. Sophia turned toward him, holding up a folder. "Good morning, boss. Ready for another thrilling day of spreadsheets and meetings?" He stopped beside her desk, eyeing the folder she held out. "Is the report ready?" "Right here." She extended it to him. Henry hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before taking it. The memory of their last touch was still fresh in his mind. To his surprise, Sophia didn't let go right away. She held it firmly, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Are you okay?" she asked, catching him off guard. "What? You seem off today." He schooled his expression, tugging the folder from her grasp with a little more force than necessary. "I'm perfectly fine." Sophia narrowed her eyes, unconvinced. "If you say so." She turned back to her computer, but Henry stood there longer than he should have. Then, without another word, he retreated into his office, trying to ignore the fact that she could see right through him. The day dragged on, slow and frustrating. Henry tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept drifting. He needed to put an end to this. By the end of the afternoon, he made a decision. He called Sophia into his office. She walked in, completely at ease, as if she weren't dealing with one of the most feared CEOs in the country. "Go ahead," she said, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. Henry took a deep breath. "From now on, I want to keep all interactions strictly professional. No unnecessary conversations. No jokes." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?" "Yes." She tilted her head, studying him. "So, I assume that also means you'll stop staring at me all the time." Henry stiffened. "I don't stare at you." Sophia smirked. "Oh, so it's just a coincidence that every time I look up, your eyes are already on me?" He kept his posture firm. "You're mistaken." She laughed. "If you say so, boss." She turned to leave, but Henry spoke before he could stop himself. "Are you free for dinner tonight?" Sophia stopped in her tracks and slowly turned, her eyes slightly wide. "Wait, what?" Henry cleared his throat. "Dinner. With me." She blinked a few times. "Is this a joke?" "No." Sophia studied him for a moment. "And here I thought you didn't want unnecessary conversations." "It's a business dinner." "Of course it is." She smirked, and Henry realized he had already lost this battle. 2 hours later, they were seated at an elegant restaurant. Sophia glanced at the menu, pretending to be impressed. "Wow, even the prices here seem arrogant." Henry didn't respond. She smirked. "So, is this how you always invite someone to dinner? No explanation? No warning? I figured you wouldn't say no." She laughed. "And I didn't. I'm just surprised." Once they ordered, she leaned forward slightly. "So, why did you bring me here?" Henry hesitated. "I told you, it's a business dinner." "Liar." He raised an eyebrow. "What? You didn't bring me here for business. You're trying to test something." Henry went completely still. Sophia smiled knowingly. "I saw your face at the event last night. You're trying to figure out what changed." She rested her chin on her hand, watching him closely. "What happened to you?" He didn't answer, because, for the first time, he didn't have one. And worse, he wasn't sure if he even wanted one. Henry tried everything to shake off the thoughts of Sophia Morris, but no matter what he did, she lingered in his mind. Avoiding her only made him more aware of her presence. Ignoring her made him restless. And now, to make matters worse, she knew something had changed in him, and that only made her more determined to push his boundaries. She had started testing him, small touches on his wrist, teasing comments that made his pulse race, a knowing smile whenever she caught him looking. Henry didn't want to give her that power, but he couldn't deny it anymore. Sophia had gotten under his skin. Then came the final blow. That evening, Henry attended a corporate event at the rooftop of one of the city's most prestigious hotels. He knew Sophia would be there. Her job required it. But he wasn't prepared for what he saw the moment he arrived. His eyes immediately found her. Sophia wore a deep wine-colored dress, elegant and perfectly fitted. The open-back design revealed just enough, her hair cascading in soft waves. The effortless smile she wore as she conversed with those around her was disarming. Too easy. Too natural. Henry hated the way he felt seeing her like that. If he had to put it into words, it felt like possessiveness. And that was dangerous. The night dragged on, filled with small talk, business discussions, and forced composure. He tried to avoid Sophia, but every time he looked across the room, there she was, laughing, talking, captivating everyone around her. Then he saw it, the moment that crossed the line. Sophia stood at the bar, talking to a man Henry knew well, Nathan Carter. Charming, smooth, and well known for his flirtatious nature. Nathan was never one to miss an opportunity with a beautiful woman. And then, it happened. Nathan placed his hand on Sophia's waist. Something in Henry snapped. Before he knew it, he was moving. Fast. Sophia was mid-laugh when she felt someone beside her. Before she could react, Henry gripped her arm, firm, but not rough. She turned to him, startled. "Henry." Nathan raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Well, if it isn't Henry Smith. Are you interrupting something?" Henry ignored him. His gaze locked onto Sophia. "I need to talk to you. Now." She blinked, confused. "We're in the middle of a conversation. Can it wait?" Henry didn't answer. His grip tightened just slightly, enough for her to feel the tension radiating from him. Nathan chuckled, clearly amused. "Relax, Henry. I wasn't going to steal your girl." Sophia's eyes widened. "What? No." But Henry was already leading her away, guiding her to a secluded area of the rooftop, away from curious eyes. Sophia yanked her arm free, crossing her arms. "What is your problem?" Henry exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "He was touching you." She stared at him. "So what?" "It was just a casual touch." His jaw clenched. "I didn't like it." For a moment, Sophia was silent. Then a slow, teasing smile formed on her lips. "Henry, are you jealous?" He swallowed hard. "No." "Then what is this?" She stepped closer, eyes locked on his. "Tell me the truth." Henry could smell her perfume, feel the warmth of her presence. It was suffocating, overwhelming. "There's no truth," he said, his voice low. She tilted her head, studying him. "So if I did it again, with another man, you wouldn't care?" Henry closed his eyes for a brief second, and then, before he could stop himself, he grabbed the back of her neck and kissed her. It was fast, intense, no hesitation. Sophia froze for only a moment before responding, her hands gripping the lapels of his jacket as she kissed him back. The noise of the party disappeared. The world around them blurred. All that mattered was this touch, this moment. Henry was the one to pull away first. Slowly, he opened his eyes, meeting Sophia's stunned, breathless gaze. And that's when reality hit him. "This should never have happened," he said, his tone colder than he intended. Sophia blinked. "What?" He took a step back. It was a mistake. Her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "So you kiss me like that, and now it's a mistake?" Henry didn't know what to say. He could still feel the warmth of her lips on his. And yet, he couldn't allow this. He wouldn't. Because Sophia Morris wasn't just any woman. And this wasn't just any mistake. He could still taste her on his lips. His body burned where she had touched him, but he knew he couldn't let this go any further. He couldn't allow her to have that kind of power over him. "Forget it," he said, forcing his voice to stay cold. Safia let out a sarcastic laugh. "Henry, you are unbelievable." He turned to leave, but before he could take more than 2 steps, he felt her hand on his arm again. "Don't run." He stopped, but he didn't look at her. She stepped closer. "You kissed me, Henry. You pulled me in. And now you want to pretend it didn't happen." He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to regain control. Then, without turning around, he said the only thing that might push her away. It was just an impulse. That's all. Safia stood still. Henry felt the tension in her silence. Then, she let go of his arm. "All right. If that's how you want to play this, then we'll play it that way." There was no anger in her voice, just determination. And in that moment, Henry knew he hadn't pushed her away. If anything, he had just made things even more dangerous. And now, he had nowhere left to run. In the days following the kiss, Henry did everything in his power to pretend it never happened. He ignored Safia at the office, buried himself in meetings and contracts, anything to keep his mind occupied. He created even more professional distance, refusing to let their eyes meet for more than a few seconds. But none of it worked, because every time he closed his eyes, he could still taste her on his lips. Every time he heard her laugh somewhere in the office, he remembered the warmth of her body against his. And every time he saw Safia walk past him without even glancing his way, something tightened in his chest. She was playing dirty. She didn't confront him, didn't demand explanations, didn't ask questions. She simply acted as if he didn't exist. And it was killing him a little more each day. By Friday night, Henry had had enough. He needed to get out. He wasn't much of a drinker, but tonight, he didn't want to think. So he went to an upscale bar in the city center, a discreet place where CEOs and executives came to unwind after exhausting weeks. He ordered a whiskey and sat in the farthest corner of the room, glass in hand, mind filled with thoughts he shouldn't be having. And then, things got worse, because the moment he leaned back in his chair to take a sip, he saw Safia walk into the bar. And she wasn't alone. Beside her, laughing and looking completely at ease, was Max Turner. Henry felt his blood boil. He didn't know what was worse, the fact that she was in the same bar as him, or the fact that she was with another man. Worse yet, Max. Max was sharp. He knew exactly what he was doing. And no matter how much Henry tried to pretend he didn't care, he did. He hated the idea of Safia with any other man. She hadn't seen him yet. But then, as if she could feel his gaze, she lifted her eyes in his direction. A moment of silence. Their eyes met. Henry's body went rigid. Safia held the eye contact for a brief moment. Then she smiled and turned her attention back to Max, as if Henry wasn't even there. Henry gripped his glass tightly. She was playing against him, and she was winning. 10 minutes later, Henry had had enough. He wasn't going to sit there pretending not to care while Safia laughed and talked with Max as if he didn't exist. So before he could change his mind, he stood up and walked toward her. Max noticed him first. "Ah, Henry, what are you doing here?" Henry didn't respond. He looked straight at Safia. "Can we talk?" Safia raised an eyebrow. Now, she seemed amused by that. "Sorry, but I'm busy." Henry felt his patience slipping. 5 minutes. That's all I need." Safia let out a dramatic sigh and glanced at Max. "Do you mind?" Max shrugged. "As long as he doesn't kidnap you, go ahead." Safia smiled and stood up. "All right then. 5 minutes." Henry grabbed her arm and led her to a quieter corner of the bar. Safia turned to him, crossing her arms. Well, what was so important? Henry didn't know where to start. He looked at her, trying to find the right words, trying not to sound as desperate as he felt. But then, Safia tilted her head and smiled again. "Henry, are you jealous?" It was like an electric shock ran through him. He couldn't deny it, but he couldn't admit it either. "Don't be ridiculous." She raised an eyebrow. Then, Henry's fists clenched. "This is not a date." "Oh, and now you get to decide who I go out with." Sophia challenged. Henry didn't answer. She took a step closer. "Tell me the truth, Henry. What do you want from me?" He didn't know. Or rather, he did, but he couldn't say it. So instead of speaking, he acted. Before he could stop himself, he cupped the back of her neck and kissed her. This was different from the first kiss. This wasn't an impulse. It was surrender. Sophia responded immediately, gripping the lapels of his jacket and pulling him closer. Their lips moved together, their breaths mingling. The bar, the people, the world, everything disappeared. Only they existed. When they finally pulled apart, Henry saw it in her eyes. Nothing would ever be the same. "Is this still a mistake?" Sophia asked, breathless. He ran a hand over his face, frustrated with himself. "Yes." Sophia laughed. "Well, I don't think so." Henry didn't know what to do anymore, but he knew one thing. He couldn't run from this any longer. Henry Smith had never been this out of control. He had spent his entire life avoiding emotions, keeping himself distant from anything that could threaten his self-control. But now, looking at Sophia Morris, still tasting her on his lips, he knew. He had completely lost this battle. He kissed her again, without thinking, without hesitation, without barriers. This time, there was no tension, no resistance. Only him and her, and the undeniable desire they could no longer ignore. Sophia matched his intensity, clutching his shirt tightly, as if she had no intention of letting him go. As if she had finally gotten what she wanted all along. When they pulled apart, breathless, Henry couldn't say a word. He didn't need to. Sophia smiled. Finally, something twisted inside him. He no longer knew what was right or wrong, but he knew he couldn't fight this anymore. In the days that followed, everything changed. Henry tried to act as if nothing had happened. He forced himself to keep his usual professional stance, to show nothing. But for the first time, Sophia wouldn't let him. She was everywhere. At the office, she looked at him with that teasing smile. In the hallways, she walked just a little too close. During meetings, she stared at him as if she knew exactly what he was trying to hide. And Henry realized he was at a disadvantage. Because unlike him, Sophia wasn't afraid to admit what she wanted. And with each passing day, he was giving in. On Friday, he arrived at the office and found a coffee on his desk. He frowned. "What is this?" Sophia smiled from her desk. "A coffee." "Why?" "Because I wanted to." He looked at her, trying to make sense of the gesture. Sophia just kept smiling. And then Henry realized he was smiling too. He couldn't deny it anymore. She affected him in a way no one ever had before, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to run from it anymore. That night, Henry was in his apartment, trying to work, when he heard a notification on his phone. A message. "I'm outside your building. Are you going to invite me up? Or are you going to keep pretending nothing is happening?" Henry felt his heart race. He could ignore it. He could simply not respond. But he didn't want to. So he answered, "Come up." Minutes later, Sophia stood in front of him. She was dressed casually, jeans and a black top. But to Henry, she had never looked more beautiful. She crossed her arms and smiled. "You're not that hard to break, you know." Henry watched her in silence. And then, he did what he had wanted to do since the very first day. He pulled her close and kissed her. This time without fear. Without hesitation. The kiss that started as a spark turned into an uncontrollable fire. Henry pulled Sophia closer, feeling the warmth of her body against his hands tracing the curve of her back as he finally allowed himself to feel everything he had been denying. Sophia didn't hold back. She had wanted him for a long time, and now there were no more barriers. His apartment was quiet, but the air between them was charged. Henry knew he should stop, but he couldn't. The feel of her skin beneath his fingertips, her scent, the way her lips fit perfectly against his. It was all too intense. But the moment Sophia slid her hands over his chest, trying to undo the buttons of his shirt, he pulled back. It was automatic, instinctive. He stepped away as if he had been jolted by electricity. Sophia looked at him, confused. "What's wrong?" Henry ran a hand through his hair, taking a deep breath, trying to find the right words. But there were no right words. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Sophia crossed her arms, studying him. "Henry, do you want me to leave?" The thought of her, walking out left an odd emptiness in his chest. He didn't want her to go, but he also didn't know how to move forward. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. I think this was a mistake. Sophia froze. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she laughed. But it wasn't amusement, it was disbelief. A mistake? Seriously, Henry? He didn't respond. Sophia shook her head, disappointed. You know what? I should have expected this. You always do this, don't you? The moment something feels out of your control, you push it away. Henry didn't deny it, because she was right. Sophia grabbed her bag and headed for the door. But before leaving, she glanced over her shoulder. You can't run from this forever, Henry. And then she was gone. Henry stood there alone, feeling the echo of her presence still filling the apartment. And for the first time, he felt truly lost. In the days that followed, Henry buried himself in work. If he had been reserved before, now he was practically a ghost in his own office. He avoided Sophia at all costs. If he stepped into the elevator and saw her there, he walked out before the doors closed. If she walked into the conference room, he found a reason to leave before they could be alone. But he knew this couldn't last forever. And he was right. It was late at night when Sophia finally cornered him. As Henry stepped out of his office, he spotted Sophia standing next to his car, arms crossed, determination written all over her face. For a split second, he considered turning back inside, but he knew she wouldn't let this go easily. With a sigh, he walked toward her. Sophia, what are you doing here? Waiting for you to stop acting like an idiot. His expression hardened. It's not that simple. Yes, it is. You're just making it complicated. Henry unlocked the car, but before he could open the door, Sophia placed her hand over his. Her touch was soft yet electric, and he froze. She stepped closer. Tell me the truth, Henry. He tried to pull away, but she held firm. Do you want me? Yes or no? Henry shut his eyes, then exhaled deeply before finally saying the truth. Yes. A slow smile spread across Sophia's face. Then stop running. He looked at her, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. What if I mess this up? She laughed. You already are. Henry knew she was right. In that moment, he made his decision. Letting out a heavy breath, he pulled Sophia into a kiss. This time, there was no fear, no hesitation, no intention of letting her go. He held her tightly, deepening the kiss with all the intensity he had been trying to deny for so long. Sophia responded without hesitation, gripping the collar of his shirt and pulling him closer, as if she had finally gotten what she had wanted from the very first day. Then thunder rumbled in the sky. They pulled apart, just enough to realize the rain was coming. Sophia laughed, her hands still gripping his shirt. Looks like the universe wants to make this moment even more dramatic. Henry glanced up at the heavy clouds overhead and made a decision. Get in the car. Sophia studied him for a second before smiling and obeying. The first few minutes inside the car were silent. Sophia kept her eyes on him, waiting for him to speak first. Henry, on the other hand, was still trying to process what had just happened. He had kissed her again, and this time, he couldn't pretend it was a mistake, because it wasn't. It was the most right thing he had done in years. Leaning back in her seat, Sophia crossed her arms. So, is this the part where you run again? Henry didn't look away. No. Good. She smiled. Because I was getting tired of that. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. I'm not good at this. Sophia raised an eyebrow. Good at what? He hesitated. Relationships. Sophia laughed. Neither am I, but I don't think that's a problem. Henry looked at her, his voice quieter. What if I mess everything up? She met his gaze, unwavering. Then we fix it. He had never met anyone like her, someone who wasn't afraid, someone who didn't pull away. And for the first time, he wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could stop running, too. In the days that followed, everything changed, and yet, nothing changed. They were still Henry Smith and Sophia Morris, boss and assistant, CEO and employee. But now there was something more. Their glances lingered a little longer. Their touches were more frequent, even if subtle. And above all, There was an unspoken tension between them. Sophia loved testing his limits. Once, during a meeting, she deliberately dropped a pen near him. When she bent down to pick it up, she whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "You're looking at me." Henry didn't react, but inside, he felt it. She challenged him constantly, and the worst part? He liked it. But Henry still wasn't fully ready. He kept their relationship a secret. He never talked about it, never made it official. And Sophia noticed. It was on a Friday night, during dinner at his apartment, that she finally brought it up. "How long are we going to keep this up?" Henry looked at her, confused. "Keep what up?" Sophia put down her fork and crossed her arms. "You know what I mean. Us. You act like we're together, but at the same time, you keep everything so quiet. It's like we're hiding a crime." Henry didn't answer right away, because he knew she was right, but he didn't know how to change it. Sophia sighed. "Henry, are you ashamed of me?" His eyes widened. "What? No. Then why does it feel like you're afraid to admit we're together?" Henry ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "It's not that. I've never done this before." Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then, gently, she asked, "Are you afraid of losing me?" Henry felt the weight of her words. Because, yes, he was afraid. Afraid of getting attached. Afraid of opening up. Afraid of trusting and being left behind again. Sophia reached across the table and took his hand. "Henry, I'm not Amelia." His breath hitched. She continued, "I'm not her. I won't walk away when things get hard, but you have to let me in." Henry felt something inside him crack. He wanted to believe her, but he wasn't sure if he could, and that terrified him more than anything. In the days that followed, Henry became even more distant, not intentionally, but because he was handling everything the wrong way. And Sophia noticed. She didn't push him, but she didn't like it. Then, on a Wednesday, everything finally exploded. Sophia was called into a meeting with Henry and the other executives. Throughout the entire discussion, he barely looked at her. He acted as if nothing had ever happened between them. And that was the breaking point. As soon as the meeting ended, Sophia followed Henry into his office and shut the door behind her. He turned around, surprised. "What is it?" Sophia didn't waste any time. "What do you want from me, Henry?" He frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Do you want me? Yes or no?" He said nothing. Sophia took a step closer. "Because if you don't, then tell me now. But if you do, then stop treating me like a stranger in front of everyone else." Henry felt a tightness in his chest. He knew he had to make a choice, but he still wasn't ready. So he made a mistake. "Maybe it's best if we end this." Sophia froze. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she laughed, but it wasn't amusement, it was bitterness. She grabbed her bag and headed for the door. "Congratulations, Henry. You got what you wanted." And then she was gone. This time, Henry didn't stop her. And that was the biggest mistake of his life. Henry Smith thought he was doing the right thing. He had spent years building walls around himself, protecting himself from anything that could make him lose control. But now, as he stared at the closed door where Sophia had just walked out, he knew he had made a colossal mistake. He wanted to believe this was for the best, that keeping his distance was the rational choice. But then came the silence, and for the first time in a long time, he realized just how unbearable that silence was. Sophia, on the other hand, didn't want to think about him. She was tired of waiting for Henry to admit what he felt, tired of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. So the next day, she simply moved on. Or at least, she tried to. But ignoring Henry wasn't easy. He was everywhere, in the office, in meetings, in the hallways. And every time she saw him, she could feel his eyes on her. But this time, she didn't look back. She was determined to live her life without him. And Henry didn't know how to handle that. In the days that followed, Henry became a different man. He was still the same ruthless, disciplined CEO. But inside, he was a mess. He couldn't sleep. He barely ate. And worst of all, he couldn't stop thinking about her. His apartment felt empty without her presence. The office felt cold without her teasing. And Henry started to realize something terrifying. He no longer knew how to live without Sophia Morris. But Sophia wasn't going to wait for him. On Friday night, She went out with friends. Henry only found out because, by chance, he saw a picture of her on social media. She was at a bar, smiling, holding a colorful drink in her hand. And next to her, there was a man. He couldn't breathe properly. This wasn't just jealousy, it was panic. Because for the first time, Henry realized she could actually move on without him. And he wasn't ready for that. That same night, he went after her. He had never done anything so irrational in his entire life. But he didn't care. When he walked into the bar and saw Sophia laughing, enjoying herself, he knew he had to do something. He couldn't let her go. So he walked straight to her. Sophia noticed him instantly, and she didn't hide her surprise. "What are you doing here?" Henry didn't answer, because he didn't know what to say. Sophia narrowed her eyes. "Oh, I see. You pushed me away, and now you show up stalking me." Henry felt his stomach twist. "I need to talk to you." Sophia let out a sharp laugh, crossing her arms. "No." Henry froze. "Sophia, please." "Now you say please? Where was that humility when you tossed me aside like I was a problem?" Henry had no answer. Sophia took a deep breath and grabbed her purse. "You know what? Let's just get this over with. Say what you need to say." Henry hesitated, but he knew he couldn't run anymore. So he said the only thing that mattered. "I love you." Sophia went still. Henry had never felt so vulnerable in his life. "What?" she asked, like she wasn't sure she had heard him right. Henry took a deep breath. "I love you." Sophia didn't say a word. Then she laughed, but it was nervous laughter. "Really? Now you decide to tell me this?" Henry's heart pounded. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but I—" Sophia cut him off. "Henry, I waited so long to hear that." She sighed, looking at him. "But now, I don't know if I still want to." Henry felt his chest tighten. Sophia smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "If you really love me, you'll have to prove it." And then she walked away. This time, he knew he had to chase after her. Because if he didn't, he would lose her forever. Henry Smith was not willing to lose Sophia Morris. He had made every mistake possible, pushed her away, ran from his own feelings, and refused to admit the truth. But now, after seeing her walk away, he finally understood what he had to do. Realizing she might truly be gone, Henry felt a terrifying truth sink in. Without Sophia Morris, his life had no meaning. She was the only thing that made sense, and he was about to prove it. The next morning, Sophia was at her desk, trying to focus on work, when she sensed a stir in the office. Murmurs, whispers, people turning their heads, some even holding up their phones, recording. She frowned and turned to Max, who was staring down the hallway in surprise. "What's going on?" she asked. Max smirked. "I think your boss has lost his mind." Before she could ask more, Henry Smith appeared, but not in his usual polished form. He wasn't in a perfectly tailored suit. In fact, he wasn't even wearing shoes. His suit was a mess, completely drenched, and in his hands was a massive bouquet of flowers. Sophia nearly choked on her coffee. Henry looked nervous, uncomfortable even, but his determination was clear. He walked straight up to her desk, stopped, and then he knelt down. The entire office froze. Sophia was speechless. Everyone held their breath. Then Henry spoke. "Sophia Morris." He swallowed hard, looking like a man bearing his soul for the first time. "I was an idiot. A complete, absolute, ridiculous idiot." Someone in the back muttered, "That's true." Henry shot them a deadly glare before turning back to Sophia. "I ran because I was scared. Because I've never felt anything like this before. Because you, Sophia, did something no one else ever has." Sophia wasn't sure if this was real or if she had hit her head and was hallucinating. But Henry kept going. "You made me feel." The entire room let out a collective sigh. Henry took a deep breath. "And now, I don't want to run anymore. I don't want to spend another second without you. Because without you, nothing makes sense." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Sophia's eyes widened as he opened it, revealing a diamond engagement ring that sparkled under the office lights. He gave her a nervous, lopsided smile. "Sophia Morris, will you marry me? Will you put up with me for the rest of your life, even though I'm the most stubborn, difficult man on the planet?" The office erupted into murmurs. Someone laughed. Max whistled. Sophia felt tears sting her eyes. And then, something unexpected happened. She laughed. Because this was so ridiculously perfect. So Henry Smith. She couldn't believe this was the same man who had run from her for so long. She looked at him, kneeling there vulnerable, and felt her heart overflow. So, she gave the only possible answer. Of course, I'll marry you, you idiot. Henry let out a relieved laugh, took the ring, and slid it onto her finger. And the moment she looked at him again, he kissed her, right there, in the middle of the office, in front of everyone. And no one had ever seen Henry Smith so happy. Months later, Sophia still couldn't believe it was real. She stood in front of the mirror, wearing a stunning wedding dress, trying to process the fact that in just a few minutes, she would become Henry Smith's wife. His wife. If someone had told her this months ago, she would have laughed. But now, looking at her reflection, she knew. Everything had happened exactly as it was meant to. The door opened, and Max stepped inside. Are you ready? Sophia took a deep breath, smiled, and nodded. More than ever. Henry stood at the altar, more nervous than he had ever been in any business meeting. He had never liked ceremonies, never liked being the center of attention. But the moment he saw Sophia walking into the church, he forgot how to breathe. She was perfect, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He knew this was what he wanted, what he had always wanted. She walked toward him, her smile radiant, and when she stopped by his side, Henry took her hand and whispered, "You look absolutely stunning." Sophia smiled. "And you're sweating." He chuckled. Then the wedding began. The vows were emotional. Sophia made Henry laugh and cry at the same time. And when it was time to say, "I do," Henry didn't hesitate for even a second, because for the first time in his life, he was absolutely certain of what he wanted. And what he wanted was Sophia. The reception was unforgettable. Max gave a speech that had half the guests laughing until they cried. Sophia dragged Henry onto the dance floor, even though he insisted he didn't know how to dance. And at the end of the night, as they watched fireworks light up the sky, Henry pulled her into a tight embrace. "I never thought I'd be able to have this," he admitted. Sophia smiled against his chest. "Have what?" He looked into her eyes. "Someone like you." Sophia kissed him gently. "Well, get used to it, because now you're stuck with me." Henry smiled, because this time he didn't want to run. He only wanted to stay forever. What did you think of Henry and Sophia's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments and rate this story from 0 to 10. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories. And check out more emotional stories by clicking here on the final screen.